Uh-huh. So remove this. So the last words that we saw, you get the signal now? Okay? Okay. So we ended last week with verse 23, and it ended with, he who does work as a sacrifice for the Lord. So among the things that we need to do to be able to not affect it by the is to, I mentioned a list of 7 things, and one of the things that I mentioned was to do work as a sacrifice for the Lord. The word used is yajna, from the Sanskrit root yaj puja yam. It means to worship. So work that is done with a spiritual ideal in mind. Now it could be a theistic ideal in the form of a personal God when you do everything out of love for God, or it could be a non-theistic ideal in terms of the spirit. So we are not referring to some personal form of divine, but the impersonal spiritual ideal. Irrespective of whether it's personal or impersonal, if the motive behind our activities is spiritual, then we will be free from the negative and the binding nature of work in itself. So the next set of 8 verses, which we will look at today, deal with the different ways work can be done as a form of worship. Work can be done as a form of sacrifice or yajna. So the word sacrifice here is used not in a way we normally speak about sacrifice. Well, it is a kind of sacrifice, but it's more a technical term here, meaning yajna or worship. So the verse 24 may be familiar to many of you. It's the verse that we chant before meals in all the Vedanta societies. One person told me who had used to chant this verse every day before meal. So he says, even when I do Gita reading, every time I come at this verse, I automatically start feeling a little hungry. Again, that's the power of association. So verse 24. You probably don't even need to look at the book to chant this. Brahmarpanam brahmahavihi Brahmagnau brahmanahutam Brahmaiva tena gantavyam Brahma karma samadhina. The ladle is Brahman, the oblation is Brahman, it is offered by Brahman in the fire, which is Brahman. Brahman alone he attains who sees Brahman in action. As you can see, the verse itself, there is no direct reference to food. So what does the verse really mean in literally? And this is exactly, it's the ritual of the Homa fire, the fire worship. As you know, the traditional form of worship was a fire is lit, it's sanctified, there is the divine invoked in the fire, and then offerings are made in the fire. That offerings could be oftentimes just ghee, sometimes bilwa leaves, and there are sometimes flowers. These are just symbols, and fire is considered a messenger or a kind of a postal service, if you like, who will carry these offerings to the different deities to whom it is offered. So that is the traditional form of worship. Now, all this will seem like, well, what's the point of all of this? The point of all of this will make sense only if we go to the heart of every ritual. And as I've often said, rituals taken superficially are not of much value. But every ritual has a soul to it. Every ritual has a deeper underlying purpose behind it. So, practiced with that deeper underlying heart or soul of that ritual, then that ritual becomes very meaningful. And I have oftentimes mentioned the social rituals, like wishing someone good morning, a good day. That's a ritual because you're just saying something, good morning. These are just two words. But if that, when you wish someone good morning or happy birthday, if that ritual of saying, uttering those words is done with a real heart filled with the good wish for that person, then that ritual becomes meaningful. Otherwise, it's just empty. And I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind. So same thing with regard to these offerings that are done or the puja that is done with the underlying spiritual goal in mind. Those rituals are extremely meaningful. So one important thing here is this. Oftentimes when we speak about rituals, we always tend to think in terms of this something external form of worship. It's something outer. And because we tend to think that, something inner or the mind or the intellect is somehow higher than the external actions, rituals kind of are not looked upon too highly by many people. What is often not realized that the puja that we do, the rituals that we do, has a corresponding psychological component to it. In fact, a lot more is happening in the mind of the worshipper than what is happening in the movement of the hand and the offering of the flowers and incense that we see externally. And so when this external physical actions combined with the right form of concentration of the mind and a visualization in the mind, combined with these, the ritual becomes extremely powerful. So similarly here, this particular verse, which has just basically, you're using a particular kind of spoon that's called the ladle here, arpanam. You're offering an oblation in the fire. At the most superficial level, here is a fire, you're picking up something and putting it in the fire. That's it. Doesn't seem to convey much. But moment you realize that the spoon with which you are picking up the oblation is filled with the same divine presence. The fire which is in front of you is filled with the same divine presence. The offering that is done is also divine. The one who is offering it is also divine. In other words, it's the presence of the divine in everything that is around us and in every activity in which we are engaged. Now with this awareness, when that offering is done, it becomes extremely meaningful. Not just meaningful, it has enormous transformative power. It can change the person. It can make the person purer. By purer I mean when we do worship or meditation or prayer with that complete faith and concentration, at the end of it, you feel better. You feel happier. You feel more peaceful. You feel you're calm. Something has changed. Sometimes that change may not last too long, but even if it's temporary, something has changed. Now, if that practice is done with complete dedication, that change lasts much longer. And the residual change is permanent. Now we can see why we chant this verse before food every day. The idea is not that, it is a kind of sacrifice. You are not putting it in some fire outside, but there is a fire inside. In fact, oftentimes, the word that is used in ancient text is Jatara Agni. Jatara means a stomach. Agni is a fire. And of course, it's common knowledge. When you have a good meal, you will see the stomach area becomes a bit warm. Clearly, there's a lot of activity going on. All the digestion has to take place and all. So it is warm, and oftentimes, even Ayurveda especially, the doctors recommend. One of the reasons they say it's not a good practice to drink water or or soft drink, like some people like to drink Coke or Pepsi during meal, not really a good idea. Partly because there is this fire which the digestive juices, there is a fire lit. And so it is said that if we take too much cold stuff while we are trying to have our major meal of the day, digestion processes are hindered. So digestion may be affected. And so the advice that often gets given, often given and of course often flouted, is not to drink water while you are eating, maybe to drink a couple of hours after you finish your meal. It's good to keep a glass of water nearby, although sometimes if you may need it, but that's the advice. And the reason is because of the fire. So there is some connection. So if we believe, and one of the ways of looking at the act of eating food is that if the divine is present within me, then rather than me eating for my own taste and my own self, why can I not see that I'm feeding the Lord in my heart? And so it is really an offering that is being done. So it's possible to draw parallels from this verse to the act of eating. And in general, to recognize that the food in front of me is filled with the presence of the divine. In fact, when we offer food to the divine, it becomes prasad. And what is prasad? Really means food that is touched by the presence of the divine. So food in front of me is filled with the divine. That the one to whom is being fed is the divine, because there is a divine within me. The act of eating itself, the hands that I use, the ladle, the spoon, this is also filled with the divine. The whole world is filled with the divine. In other words, every entity involved in the act of eating has the presence of the divine within it. So when you now next, before eating the meal, chant this verse, Brahmarpanam, don't do it mechanically. Try to, at the back of the mind, remember this is all divine. Everything is filled with the divine. And when that verse is chanted with that awareness, the food will be even more tasty. Try it out and see. Verse 25. Daivameva pare yajñam yoginah paryupasate brahmagna vapare yajñam yajne naivopajuvhati. Sacrifices to the gods alone other karma yogis resort to. Still others offer the sacrifice by way of a sacrifice in the fire of Brahman alone. So now there are different ways of doing the worship. There are some people some karma yogis who are trying to do work in an ideal way, consider every work as a worship of deities. There are so many different deities that the people worship. Now, when those deities are worshipped without the awareness that they are in fact different forms of that same one infinite divine being, then that worship is still limited. That worship has a tinge of ignorance attached to it, because I am worshipping an aspect, a form, a manifestation of the divine without the awareness that that's only a one manifestation of that infinite being behind it. So that is what is said. So some people do this sacrifice, do the yajna, looking upon the gods alone. Gods alone means without the awareness that in reality they are all Brahman. That is what they do. And some others, the second part of the verse is actually referring to the verse 24. Sacrifice by way of sacrificing the fire of Brahman alone. So that is, whenever we do every activity as a form of worship of that infinite being, even when we are worshipping a specific form of the divine, whether you worship Shiva or Vishnu or Ramakrishna or Buddha or Jesus, these are specific forms of the divine, specific in the sense they have a specific name, they have a specific history, they have a specific mythology surrounding them. Even when we worship any of these different manifestations of the divine, but at the back of my mind, if I know that behind this name stands the nameless, behind this form stands the formless. So if I do it, then that becomes a fire of Brahman alone. So behind all of this stands Brahman. So there are two things I mentioned here. One form of worship with the specific forms of the divine without recognizing that they are aspects of Brahman. And the second one is worshipping everything as an offering to Brahman, even when I am worshipping it in a specific aspects of the divine. So the second one, which is elaborated in verse 24, is called Jnana Yoga. That is the worship done by those who are followers of the path of knowledge. Because it's the knowledge that everything is filled with the divine that's the basis of that form of worship. Now, the next few verses will give other forms of yajna, other forms of worship. They are limited in nature, and what Krishna will say in the end, that among all these different forms of worship, this Jnana Yajna, the worship of everything, seeing everything as filled with Brahman, is the highest, is the best. Now, in order to emphasize something is highest, you will also have to give a list of something which is not the highest. So only then by comparative you know, oh, these have limited utility as opposed to the one which is the best form. So now the next few verses will give very good forms of worship, very effective forms of worship, but still somewhat limited in nature. So verse 26. श्रोत्रादीनि इन्द्रियाणि अन्ये संयमाग्निषु जुह्वति शब्दादीन् विषयानन्ये इन्द्रियाग्निषु जुह्वति. So again, two other forms of worship are mentioned here. Others offer the ear and other senses as a sacrifice in the fire of self-control. Others again offer sound and other objects of the senses in the fires of the senses. So the first form of yajna is the different senses that we have. And the fire here is a fire of self-control. So all this worship is offering things in the fire. So in this form of worship, the fire is a fire of self-control. And all the senses are offered into it. In other words, this kind of put in a symbolical language, essentially it means practice of self-control itself becomes a form of worship. So instead of allowing the senses to run carelessly in an unrestrained way towards their objects, if I make an effort to control the senses, then that becomes a form of worship also. So the self-control itself becomes a fire in which the senses are offered. The second form of worship given here in the second half of the verse is offering sound and other objects in the senses, in the fire of the senses. So here in the second form of worship, the senses itself become the fire, and all the objects of the senses are offered into it. In other words, all the sights that we see are offered into the fire of the sense of sight. All the sounds that we hear are offered into the fire of the sense which perceives sound. So it's a you see the distinction. The first one is the practice of self-control. The second one is a practice where even when your senses are active, that you recognize that whatever is being taken in by the senses is being it's a form of worship that is being offered into the fire of the senses. The bottom line, that even when we are engaged in apparently material life, we still somewhere in every material experience that we have, we still have the awareness that there is still this form of worship going on. So all the sights, all the sound, all the tastes are still being offered into the different senses. So these are again specific forms of worship. Worship done as a self-control, worship done as an awareness that all sense experience is done with the awareness that it is a form of worship. So these are two other kinds of yajnas that are referred here in verse 26. Verse 27. Sarvani indriya karmani prana karmani chapare atma sanyama yogagnau juhati jnana dipite. Others offer the functions of all the organs and pranas in the fire of the yoga of self-control lighted by knowledge. Now this is the form of worship that's done by dhyanis, those who are primarily contemplators, those whose primary practice is meditation or contemplation. What do? All the functions of the organs and the pranas are all the life activities that are going on. Some of them are voluntary, most of them are involuntary. Within us, in the fire of the yoga of self-control. In the fire of the yoga of self-control here is, the yoga here is meant concentration. As you may remember, the word yoga comes from a root, two different roots, and therefore it has two distinct meanings. One meaning of the word yoga is concentration, and that is how Patanjali uses it. When he says yogas chitta vritti nirodhaha, yoga means stilling the waves in the mind. So here yoga clearly means concentration. But yoga has one more meaning when it's derived from a different root, and there it means a union, to join. Comes closer to the English word to yoke. And there it's the joining of the limited with the unlimited, the finite with the infinite. In devotional terms, it is the joining of the devotee with God, the creature with the creator. So these are the two meanings of yoga. Now here the word yoga, atma sanyama yogagnau, the fire of the yoga of self-control. Here the word yoga is used in the sense of concentration. So those who are contemplatives by nature, they offer all the activities, including the life force, the various forms that force, beginning with breathing, of course, that's one of the most palpably experienced effects of prana in our life. So in other words, when we try to sit and meditate, we become aware. Let me put it this way. When we try to meditate, we are trying to shut out the world as much as possible. To the extent we succeed in shutting out the world, to that extent we also become aware of some of the subtle things that are happening within us. Sometimes we feel that why does my mind get so distracted or disturbed only when I try to sit and meditate? Uh, it might seem, oh, I was pretty calm most of the day, even when I'm engaged in my work, but only when I sit for meditate, then my mind starts running here and there. Um, Actually, that's what's happening is this. When I'm going about my day's activities throughout the day, there are a lot of things to distract me. And because my mind is engaged in hundreds of things around me, hundreds of things that I'm thinking about, I'm doing, I'm not so much aware of the subtle things that are demanding attention within my heart. Now, when we try to sit for meditating, we, as far as possible, try to sit in a quiet spot. We try to free our mind as much as possible from all other distractions. It's then that the mind has the privilege and the opportunity then to look at some of the very quiet things that are happening within us. You might suddenly discover, oh, there is some slight ache that you have in the neck or something, which you may not have experienced throughout the day. But only when you sit, then you suddenly feel, oh, this is paining, or this is, or whatever. So all these activities that are going on within us, and of course, apart from the stress and exhaustion and anxiety, that's kind of there always, offering all of that into the fire of concentration. In other words, I try to concentrate in my meditation so much that all of these things put inside it subside. I mean, what does fire do? You put anything into the fire eliminates it, reduces it to ashes. So if my concentration is good while meditating, then all these tiny distractions will get burnt in the fire of concentration. And then that becomes a worship. So that becomes an inner worship, where all the distractions, inner and outer, are put into the fire of concentration. So that's the form of worship that described here in verse 27. Verse 28. Dravya yajna stapo yajna yoga yajna statha pare swadhyaya jnana yajnascha yataya samshita vrataha. So here 4 or 5 different forms of worship are mentioned. There are others who sacrifice through gifts, others again who sacrifice through penance, and still others who sacrifice through yoga, while there are others, aspirants of austere vows, who sacrifice through knowledge from scriptural studies. So, what are the other kinds of worship? One is dravya yajna, giving of gifts. So, that's a kind of worship also. A needy person arrives, or there is a needy cause which needs my help, and if I give that help in the form of some material entity, with the awareness that I'm giving it to the divine who has come to me in this form. So here it is a hungry person. I can just feed a hungry person saying, well, I'm being charitable, or how wonderful I am that I am so helpful, which kind of boosts my ego. And that's not a very spiritual way to do it. But if it's true that God is present in all, that in fact God alone exists, then even when a homeless, helpless, hungry person comes in before me, and I give food to that person, recognizing that there is this divine in the form of this person, and I am now worshipping that divine who has come in that form, then that would be dravya yajna. That's a form of worship as well. Again, a very specific form of worship. Others again who sacrifice through penance. Tapas means penance. So oftentimes different people practice different kind of austerities. One of the common forms of austerity is a periodic fasting, for instance. Say every Ekadashi day or every 15 days, you say, I'm not going to have my normal 4 or 5 meals a day. Or you can just say, I'm just going to eat little or nothing. And, well, that's good for health anyway. But more than that, the time and energy that goes in eating and digesting a meal, I will try to use that time and energy on that particular day to think more of the divine. Maybe do a little bit more japa or pray a little longer. So then that would be an austerity. Then that would be a form of worship also. So and we know that even when we undertake some activity which may entail some hardship, but if it's done out of love for God, we know it feels good. We know that I'm doing something which is holy, which is sacred. And so that's the form of worship that's referred to here. And still others who sacrifice through yoga. Here yoga again means concentration. Yoga in the form of practicing concentration. Well, there are others, aspirants of osteobhaus, who sacrifice through knowledge from scriptural studies. So these can also be seen as two different forms of worship or a combined thing. Sacrifice through knowledge and sacrifice through scriptural studies. So studying scriptural texts, studying holy books itself can be seen as a form of worship. Sometimes it's called Vangmayi Puja. Vang means speech. So worship through words. The words can be taken in through a book. The words can be taken in through hearing. The words can be released through speaking. So sometimes even a religious discourse can be seen as a form of worship. Giving a religious discourse is a form of worship. Listening to a religious discourse is also a form of worship. So sometimes there were series of talks sometimes given by religious teachers, and they call it Jnana Yoga. Sometimes if there are talks on the Gita, then they call it Gita Yoga. So again, it's possible, and in fact it's a good idea that when we meet every Wednesday, we can either see it as a study group. Clearly, of course, we are studying together, so this is a study group. But nothing stops you from looking at this, yes, it's a worship. These are words of Krishna, the holy words of the text, which have this enormous transforming power. So nothing prevents you from saying, so one, if I can now try to listen to these words of the Gita as a form of worship, that has its own benefit. Nothing prevents me, rather than saying, well, I'm now teaching Gita, to say, well, here are these words of Krishna. In the effort I make to think about it and share the views, I'm doing worship as well. So that is what is meant by sacrifice through knowledge from scriptural studies. So every study itself can become a form of worship. Our whole life can become a form of worship. There is that one beautiful verse which I love very much. It's in a hymn that Shankaracharya wrote. This is how it goes. It's a form of mental worship really. It goes like this. Atma tvam girija mati sahachara prana shariram griham pujate vishayopabhoga rachana nidra samadhi sthitihi sanchara padayo pradakshina vidhi stotrani sarva giro yat yat karma karomi tattadakilam shambho tavaradhanam. Understood? It's a beautiful, beautiful verse. What it means? Atma Tvam. Lord, you are the Atman. Girija Matihi. The power, the Shakti, the divine power is the intellect. Sahachara pranaha. All the senses that I have are actually the attendants of the divine. So the Atman is the divine, the power of the Atman is the intellect. All my senses are the attendants to the divine, attendants of the Atman. Shariram griham, this body is the temple of the divine. If God dwells within me, then this body can be seen as a temple of the divine. So just as when we go in a temple, we feel that sense of sanctity. When we think about and deal with the body, we can practice to have that same kind of sanctity, which also then will encourage us to deal with the body responsibly, not abuse the body, which really means then doing everything to maintain good health. See that the great gift that God has given us, the home in which God dwells, let me take good care of the home. So when we go to a temple, we don't mind going to a temple, and it's a great privilege to go and take good care of the temple. Similarly, I should take good care of the body, not for self-gratification, but recognizing it as the home in which the divine dwells. So, the spirit or the Atman is the divine, the intellect, the higher power of spiritual intuition that we have, that is the power of the Atman, power of the divine. The senses are the attendants, the body is the temple, the dwelling of the divine. Pujate Vishaya Upabhoga Rachana, the worship. This was one of the worships that we referred to. All the sensory input that we have in the form of sight, sound, and everything are the different ingredients used for worship. In the worship that we are familiar with, there is flower, incense, water, fruits and sweets. Now here, in this form of cosmic worship, which is subtle, all the sensory inputs, all the objects of the senses, they are all different ingredients. Nidra samadhi stitihi. Sleep is a form of being in deep samadhi. So one form of samadhi we all experience every day anyway. So rather than seeing sleep simply as and when we'll actually think about it this way, in sleep we are freed temporarily from the identity with the body and mind, and that's why you feel rested after your sleep. In some ways we are closer to our true self, closer to the divine in that state of deep sleep. And can I then look upon that sleep also, not as just one kind of a biological phenomenon, but also a form of being samadhi, because I am closer, one with the divine in the state of deep sleep. Sanchara padayo pradakshina vidihi. Every time I walk anywhere, can I see it as a pradakshina? There is one form of ritual that's often done in many Hindu temples, is that when you go to a temple, you go around the deity. And that's oftentimes called circumambulation sometimes. And that's considered one of the very sacred acts of going around. And in order to go around, of course, we walk. You cannot go around in a car or something. And then we walk other times of the day as well. So every time I walk, no matter where I walk to, I can see that as an act of going around the divine. Well, and since we are also driving, there's nothing prevents us from saying, even when you're driving, I'm really going around the cosmic presence of the divine. In other words, walking, driving, everything gets spiritualized. Stotrani sarva giro, all form of speech can be seen as hymns, as a form of prayer. You see, mm, the I don't know, but I probably might have mentioned this story before. Um, there was one person who had never gone to school, wasn't literate at all, but could read, and so he had a prayer book. So in which there's a prayer in the morning, a prayer before meals, and he was very devoted. And every day he would devotedly open the prayer book and say those prayers at appropriate time. One day, book was misplaced or stolen. He just couldn't find it anywhere. And he was heartbroken because that was something he had done for years together. Not a day had missed when he hadn't done the prayer. But now the book wasn't there. And he said, oh my God, so it'll be now first time this practice, this worship will come to an end because I can't pray now because the book isn't there. And then suddenly he got this idea. And then all that he did was, he just sat before the altar and just said A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, all the letters of the alphabet. Because no matter which prayer it is, they are all made up of these letters of the alphabet. And so he just said, Lord, please rearrange these alphabets appropriately so that the prayer for this time may be said. And isn't that true? You see, the highest form of philosophy, when we try to express it in words, we are still using the same letters of the alphabet. You are scolding someone, you are abusing someone, you are still using the same words of the alphabet. So no matter whether it is something wonderful being done or something terrible being done, we are using same forms of the alphabet. Now if I try to remember that every word that I speak is in fact a prayer to the divine, what it will do is not only will it sanctify speech itself, but it will make me more aware about what I say and how I say it. One of our Swamis, who some of you may have heard his name, there was Swami Ranganathanandaji. He was also a president of the order. He passed away a few years ago. He used to narrate one incident from his life. He said that once was a young boy, he was some 8 or 9 year old, and once he learned a few very bad words in school from some friends, and then, small, he learned this kind of very slang, very abusive words, and then he came home and he just uttered them. And his mother was shocked, the little boy saying all these things. But she knew, he's small, he doesn't even know the full meaning of what he's saying. And what she told him was this: rather than just tell him, you should never say that, don't say that, which is what many of us do. When we find our children and grandchildren doing something or saying something they shouldn't, we just tell them, don't do it. We don't always tell them why they shouldn't do it. We tell our children, be good. We don't tell them why they should be good. We tell them, don't be bad. We don't tell them why they shouldn't be bad. And now his mother, she told him, and he used to narrate that. He said, his mother told him that Saraswati, Mother Saraswati, the goddess of learning, she dwells on your tongue. And so whatever you say, it's a form of worship to her. And so you have to be a little bit careful of what you say, because Mother Saraswati is there. And he said that, and Mother told him very gently. And he said that went so deep into his heart. And that all through his life afterwards, he said he never could say anything which was inappropriate, anything which wasn't good. Because just that one suggestion, that this is the place of Mother Saraswati. So that is what I mean by sanctifying every aspect of our life. And so stotrani sarva giro, all the words that I speak, everything that I say is in fact a prayer, a hymn addressed to the divine. stotrani sarvagiro yad yad karomi tattad akhilam. Whatever I do in my life, small or big, is all your worship. So that's the verse. And it's a beautiful, beautiful verse. It comes in a hymn that Shankaracharya wrote. So that's the idea here. You can see all these different forms of worship are just one aspect of this completely spiritualizing every aspect of our life. Verse 29. Apane juhati pranam prane panam tatha pare pranapana rutva pranayama parayanaha. Pranayama is, as many of you are familiar, is a practice of controlling prana, but really what we actually do is we control breath. Now, breath itself is not prana, but breath is one of the most visible or tangible manifestations of prana. Prana is too subtle, but by controlling breath, we try to control prana. So breathing itself is not prana, but is one of the manifestations of prana. So now that practice itself is seen by some as a form of worship. So still others, devoted to the control of the vital force, that is pranayama, offer as a sacrifice the outgoing breath in the incoming, as also the incoming breath in the outgoing, after restraining the activity of the incoming and outgoing breath. What it means is this: there are there is not just one specific practice called pranayama. It has several variations, but it essentially consists of three parts. One is you breathe in. Then, of course, when you breathe in, you hold the breath for a while, and then you breathe out. Now, in what proportion, how long you should breathe in, how long you should hold the breath, and how long you should breathe out, that may vary depending on the different practice. But these are the three basic parts. Now, holding of the breath can be done in two ways. You either hold the breath inside or you hold the breath outside. By that I mean, one way is you breathe in, your lungs are filled with air now, hold the breath inside, then you breathe out. When you breathe in, hold the breath, breathe out. That's one way to do it. A second way to do it is breathe in, breathe out, hold the breath out before you take the second breath. Then you take the second breath, breathe out, hold the breath. So that's the two parts, and that's what is meant by offer as a sacrifice the outgoing breath in the incoming. Here it means you're holding the breath inside, and as also the incoming breath in the outgoing, you're holding the breath outside. Just a subtle difference. So even the act of pranayama, the practice of pranayama, can be seen as a form of worship. Then verse 30. Apare niyataharaha pranan praneshu juhati sarve pyete yajnavido yajnakshapita kalmashaha. There is a little bit of a typo here. So if you're using this book, translation by Swami Vireshwaranandaji, then the first, if you go to page 143, the second half of the translation really belongs to the following verse. So this verse that we chanted just now, chapter 30, the translation begins on page 143. It says, others again who regulate their food offer as a sacrifice the functions of the senses in the senses. And then continues here, all these indeed are knowers of the sacrifices, purified of their sins through sacrifices. So again, niyataharaha, those who are more careful about the food that they eat, that also can be seen as a form of worship. So the food that is taken, the kind of food that we eat, and the regular intervals at which we take. So all attention that we pay to food, about taking in and the kind of food, etc., that also is seen as a form of worship. So, and then this verse ends by saying, all these indeed are knowers of the sacrifices, purified of their sins through sacrifices. So all these forms of worship will purify us. Because as we have seen, all these different forms of worship are different ways of spiritualizing our life. Many of them are very specific, and so they have a specific context, either through concentration or through offering gifts to others, or through food and so on. And the one worship which kind of comprehends all of these, and that's why it's considered the highest, is the worship that we saw in verse 24, the verse that is chanted before meals, that recognizing that everything is nothing but Brahman. So that is considered as the highest form of worship. The other, and then we of course might say, of course we all want to do highest form of worship. Then why should we even want to do these other inferior kinds of worship at all? Now, that this is not to say that these other forms of worship are useless or bad, because as you can see, this verse says, all these purify us through sins. In other words, all these take away our weaknesses. All these make us better human beings. But that worship in which we feel and experience and try to remember the presence of God in everything that we do, that is the highest form of worship. And we oftentimes we need to practice these lower forms of worship in order to become fit for the higher form of worship. So it's like this. If you want to say, well, if I'm going to do mountain climbing, I'm going to climb Mount Everest, which is great. They say, what's the point in climbing any other mountain? I'm just going to climb Everest, which is not a bad idea. But on the other hand, you can't straight away now go to Everest and climb. You won't be able to do it. In order for me to be able to climb that highest peak, I must first learn to climb some smaller peaks. It's great to say I want to run the marathon, but if I can't run even 1 mile, then 26 miles I think is a bit too much. So running marathon is great. We'll say, well, that's the event in which to participate. Or you can say, I want to compete in the Olympics. Great. But in order for me to be eligible to compete in the Olympics, then I first must learn to take part in some of the lower events and excel there, and then I will be even selected for the... So, while seeing Brahman everywhere is the best form of worship, highest form of worship, in order to be able to do it well and correctly, I must therefore practice these other forms of worship as well. So the reason why that is called the highest form of worship is not to belittle or kind of denigrate these other forms of worship, but to show that those worships become preparations, make us ready, make us fitter than to do this highest form of worship. So these are the verses that we saw today, which give us a kind of a more comprehensive idea about how work can be done as a form of worship. And by work, as is clear by now, is not meant simply the work that we do to earn our livelihood. By work is meant every activity, including the activity of breathing, eating, everything. That's what is the idea. So you have any comments, questions, thoughts before we close? Yes, Gunjan?
From the I just had some technical difficulties
Yeah.
with verse 25,
Yeah.
where it says worshipping separate God idol.
Hmm.
They're referring to it as karma yogins. So I just want to relate
Yeah.
karma yoga with idol worship.
No, it's not. It's sacrifice to the. It's not idol worship. What is being said is that if I do everything out of love for a specific form of the divine, so it is a form of worship. For instance, now if I worship Shiva, and I say, well, I'm going to do all these wonderful works, I'm going to do all good things, I do it out of love for Shiva, which is nice, which is great. But I see Shiva as just not necessarily as a manifestation of the infinite being. Shiva is my God is different from your God and different God. So if I do everything out of love for God, but my vision of God is my God who is different or greater and conflict with other gods, then I'm lacking that deeper vision of who Shiva truly is. So that makes my worship limited. So it's not idol in the form of idol, not just like some murti or something.
Yeah, I guess my phrasing was not correct. My confusion was more with the karma yoga part. What they're calling karma yoga, I understood like worshipping a specific form of divine to be more related when we say bhakti yoga. So it's just the language.
No. Actually, you see, I mean, these divisions are not so watertight. It's not like karma yogis cannot be bhakti yogis or bhakti yogis cannot be karma yogis. You see, the idea is every form of yoga that I do, in which karma is a part, then it is a karma yogi. I mean, even a devotee, even when a devotee does worship, we'll say, well, that's worship, that's bhakti yoga. But in the worship, you are doing action. So there is karma involved in bhakti, and there is bhakti involved in karma. So they kind of merge. So yeah. So when we say something is karma yoga, does not mean it is completely isolated from devotion. Or when we say it's bhakti yoga, that doesn't mean that a devotee does no activity at all, because actually everyone is a karma yogi. As we have seen, no one can be without activity even for a moment. So karma yogi, what we have a choice about is whether we want to be karma rogis or karma yogis. That's the only thing, because karma itself is going to be always there. Yes. No? Okay. Yeah.
Swamiji, we talk about so many forms of worship. What about like our profession, our work, where we spend most of our day? Is that considered a form of worship where
you have the freedom too? Again, it's like this. Wherever you are working, essentially you can say that one way of looking at that is that is a situation in which if everything happens by the will of God, then God has put you in that situation. The talents and the knowledge that you have has also come to you through the grace of God. So by using your talent and energy and knowledge in that situation for that work, you are really doing God's work. So the idea is this: we have to be creative. If we want to spiritualize every aspect of our life, there has to be some amount of creativity involved. Is there a way I can connect somehow my way of thinking, speaking, doing to my spiritual ideal? And if I can do it, it kind of brings the disparate aspects of my life all together. It makes life integrated. Otherwise, some things remain, it's like, oh, that part of my life has nothing to do with this part of my life. Then my life remains divided. And the goal is to kind of bring it all together, because the problem is that we have gotten disintegrated. And if the whole thing has to be integrated, all the aspects of our life have to be brought together. And the one unifying link in which everything comes together is the spirit or the divine.
How we are having that kind of daily worship, or even I'm doing worship and my intention is that how I'm doing, if people are watching or not. So I'm attached with not with my Bhakti Yoga or Karma Yoga, it's more to I'm used for outer. So however we attach with our work, it can yoga goes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So the word karma, can karma become a yoga? The yoga is meant a way of connecting to the divine, a worship. So if I'm able to do work, if it connects me to the divine, then it is yoga. If it connects me to my ego or my something else, then it is not yoga. That's how. Okay.
In Swami Tyagananda gave the example. So it seems like the boy had to decide that that word is not a good thing to utter because mother Saraswati, it's not a good thing to offer to the mother. So then the question becomes, if everything we do can be worship, but we still have to decide what is a good thing to offer and what is not a good thing to offer.
Yep.
So then
We have to decide, yes.
So then sometimes maybe it gets difficult to know. How do you... Is it a moral question that becomes basically...
Well, I mean, I can understand that sometimes it may not be always easy to decide whether it's good or bad. I mean, there is always these borderline gray areas. And I think that's the time everyone has to make a personal call, a personal judgment. And one way which I find very helpful is that, is this something that will take me nearer to my spiritual ideal or away from it? Is this something that will make me forget my spiritual ideal or remember it? That could be one criteria to decide whether it is good or bad. Is this something that will make me more selfish or unselfish? Is this something that will strengthen the bond of material attachment more or a spiritual attachment? So, and again, everyone has to kind of decide a criteria for themselves to kind of figure out. And it's possible that sometimes we may make a wrong decision, and which is okay. If we make a wrong decision, at some point, life itself will show us, oh no, that was a mistake, and then I can correct it. So it's like take a wrong exit. You will be delayed a little bit, but then when you realize your mistake, you can come back again. It's a little bit like that. Okay, so we will conclude. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu. We bow down to Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother again and again.